The first thing I heard that morning was my own voice saying, "That doesn't make sense," even though I hadn't spoken out loud yet. I remember standing in my kitchen in Ashtonville, coffee untouched, staring at my phone like it might explain why the entire town was suddenly talking about my wife before I even finished breakfast. The news alert came in quietly, almost politely, like it didn't understand the weight it was about to drop. Local executive under investigation following financial discrepancies. No name at first, just enough detail for the gut to tighten. Then the second alert hit. Melissa Carter, my wife. I didn't move for a full minute. Just listened to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a delivery truck outside on Maple Street. It felt unreal, like the world had misfiled my life under someone else's story. The night before still sat heavy in my memory. A dinner, too many polite smiles, too many things said half in jest, but sharp enough to leave marks. And then her words, casual as anything, calling me a joke in front of people who didn't know me well enough to understand what that meant. I didn't respond then either. I just watched. That's what people never understand about silence. It isn't empty. It's full of observation. I noticed everything after that. The way she kept her phone face down even at home. The way her schedule started stretching in ways that didn't align with anything she told me. Meetings that had no names. Calls that ended when I entered the room. At first, I told myself it was stress. Life in Ashtonville wasn't complicated enough to assume anything worse. But there's a point where coincidence stops feeling like coincidence. It feels like structure, like something built carefully just out of sight. I worked as an engineer long enough to recognize patterns, even when they didn't belong to machines. That morning, I sat down at the edge of our dining table, the same one we'd picked out 7 years earlier when everything still felt aligned. I opened my laptop, not because I expected answers, but because I needed clarity. Emails, transactions, timelines. Small inconsistencies that didn't mean anything alone but started forming a shape when viewed together. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Just distance. The kind you feel when you realize you've been standing closer to something breaking than you thought. And somewhere in that quiet, I understood something simple but irreversible. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was a direction. And every direction leads somewhere. By the time I left the house that morning, the silence inside it felt different. Not empty, but structured, like something had already been decided without my input. Ashtonville looked the same outside, the same quiet streets, the same steady flow of early traffic near Maple Avenue, but I could feel a shift in the way people moved through it. It is strange how quickly information travels in a small town, even when no one is supposed to know anything yet. I stopped for gas at the corner station near Route 9, and the attendant looked at me for a moment longer than usual before pretending to focus on the pump. He did not say anything, but I noticed the hesitation in his expression, the kind that comes when someone has already heard a version of your life that you have not been told about. I paid in silence and drove on, keeping my eyes forward, but my mind was already replaying every detail from the night before. Melissa had always been composed in public, careful with her words, precise with her image, the kind of person who understood how quickly perception becomes reality in a place like this. That is what made the memory of her voice cutting through the dinner table so difficult to place. It did not fit the version of her that I thought I knew. At the office, things were no better. 2 of my colleagues avoided direct eye contact, and one of them, Daniel Brooks, who usually greeted me every morning, simply nodded without stopping. There was no conversation about the news, but there did not need to be one. A message like that does not stay contained. It spreads through offices, through parking lots, through quiet breaks in conversation where people decide what they believe before all the facts arrive. I sat at my desk and opened my work files, trying to focus on structural design reports for a municipal project, but the numbers blurred together in a way they never had before. Around mid-morning, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something about the timing felt intentional. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Detective Ryan Holt. He spoke calmly, professionally, explaining that my name had come up in connection with a preliminary inquiry involving financial records tied to Melissa Carter. He said there was no accusation directed at me, only questions that required clarity. I remember how carefully he chose his words, as if every syllable had weight assigned to it. After the call ended, I just sat there, holding the phone, watching the reflection of fluorescent lights on the glass surface of my desk. It was the first time I allowed myself to consider that this might no longer be a private matter between two people. By noon, the first article appeared online. It did not contain full details, only fragments, enough to suggest something larger beneath the surface. I watched the headline update 3 times in 10 minutes, as if the story itself was still deciding what it wanted to become. My phone began to vibrate more frequently after that. Messages from people I had not spoken to in years. Questions disguised as concern. Comments that sounded like curiosity but carried the shape of judgment underneath. I did not respond to any of them. Instead, I went back to the one thing that still felt stable, the pattern of data I could actually verify. But even there, the structure was changing. Something had shifted in the system, and I could feel it building outward, expanding beyond anything I had control over. And in that expansion, I realized the most important change was not what was being said about Melissa or even about me, but the fact that the story was no longer contained inside our lives. It had already started to belong to everyone else. I did not realize how fast silence could turn into pressure until that afternoon, when Ashtonville no longer felt like a quiet town, but like a system reacting to something I could not fully see yet. Every place I stopped, every person I passed, seemed slightly misaligned with how they usually behaved. At the hardware store near Lincoln Avenue, the clerk who normally talked too much kept his answers short, avoiding unnecessary words as if he was trying not to be involved in something larger than a transaction. I bought nothing important, just small items I did not need, anything to delay going back home, because home no longer felt like a fixed point. It felt like a location under observation. On the drive back, I passed City Hall, and there were more cars than usual parked along the side street. A small cluster of people stood near the entrance, not panicked, not excited, but attentive in the way people become when a story is forming in real time in front of them. I kept driving, but my grip on the steering wheel tightened without me noticing. When I reached my street, I saw a news van parked half a block down. That was the first moment I felt something close to certainty that whatever was happening had moved beyond private boundaries. Inside the house, Melissa was not there. The space felt unchanged physically, but every object now felt like it belonged to a different version of the same timeline. Her coat was still on the chair by the entryway, her keys placed neatly on the counter as if she had left in a normal rhythm of the day. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the refrigerator hum, realizing how normal everything still looked compared to what was unfolding outside those walls. I opened my laptop again, but this time there were more updates, more confirmations, more references to financial irregularities tied to accounts connected indirectly to her consulting work. The language in the reports was careful, almost neutral, but the implications were no longer subtle. I did not feel shock at that point. Only a growing awareness that things I had assumed were separate were actually connected by threads I had never noticed before. Around late afternoon, Detective Ryan Holt called again. His tone was unchanged, steady, almost procedural, but there was a shift in how direct his questions had become. He asked about timelines, about when I last saw specific documents, about whether I had ever noticed inconsistencies in contracts she had access to. I answered everything as accurately as I could. But even as I spoke, I realized I was beginning to reconstruct events I had never paid attention to before. After the call ended, I sat in the living room without moving, watching the light shift across the floorboards. There was a moment where I considered calling Melissa, but I did not. Not because I was angry, but because I understood that whatever conversation would have happened between us no longer belonged to just the two of us. By evening, the second article appeared, more detailed this time, and the name Melissa Carter was no longer absent from it. I read it once, then again, not because I needed confirmation, but because I was trying to understand how quickly identity can shift when placed under public exposure. Outside, I could hear distant car doors closing, occasional voices passing by, subtle signs that the town was not just watching anymore, it was processing. And in that processing, I realized something I could not ignore. This was no longer about misunderstanding or miscommunication or even timing. It had become something irreversible, something that had already reached its next stage without asking for permission. I did not sleep that night, not because I could not, but because the town itself seemed to stay awake around me, as if Ashtonville had turned into a place that refused to settle back into normal rhythm. Every few minutes, there was the faint sound of a passing car outside, slower than usual, like drivers were looking at houses instead of roads. I stood near the window in the living room for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker against the pavement, trying to convince myself that things only felt amplified because my mind was overanalyzing patterns that were not really there. But then another news van arrived at the end of the street, parking beside the first one, and I stopped pretending. Around midnight, Detective Ryan Holt called again. This time his voice carried less explanation and more structure, as if the investigation had moved into a phase where every detail mattered. He told me that additional financial records had been flagged, and that Melissa's access to certain accounts placed her name deeper in the timeline than initially understood. He asked if I was home alone, and I answered honestly. The question itself felt heavier than the answer. After the call ended, I sat in the dark for a while without turning on any lights. I could hear the house in ways I never noticed before, small settling sounds in the walls, the faint cycle of the heating system, the distant hum of the refrigerator, all of it continuing as if nothing outside had changed. But everything outside had changed. By early morning, I saw the first version of the mugshot image circulating online. It was not attached to a full story yet, just a cropped frame shared between local pages, but the impact was immediate. The town did not wait for confirmation. It never does. I went outside briefly to get air, and that was when I noticed the neighbors behaving differently. Mrs. Halstead from across the street was standing near her mailbox longer than necessary, pretending to sort mail that she was not reading. 2 houses down, Mr. Evans was outside watering his lawn even though the ground was already wet. No one approached me, but I could feel that I was no longer invisible in the way I used to be. I drove to the office again, not because I expected normalcy, but because routine sometimes becomes the only structure left when everything else collapses into uncertainty. The office itself felt quieter than usual, even though nothing had been officially said. Daniel Brooks avoided my desk entirely. When I finally opened my computer, there were internal messages circulating about administrative leave for employees connected indirectly to the ongoing inquiry. My name was not listed, but proximity was enough to change how people looked at me. Around noon, Detective Holt came to my workplace in person. He did not arrive with urgency, only presence. We spoke in a small conference room where the blinds were partially closed, and he laid out what he could share without crossing legal boundaries. He said Melissa had been formally detained for questioning. He said the investigation was expanding, not narrowing. He also made it clear that I was not considered a suspect, but that my statements would continue to be necessary as reference points. I remember nodding through most of it, not because I fully processed it in real time, but because there was no other way to respond. After he left, I stayed in the empty conference room for a while longer than necessary, staring at the table's surface, trying to understand how quickly language had shifted from everyday conversation to procedural documentation. By the time I left the building, the afternoon sun had turned sharp and pale, casting long reflections across the parking lot. And that was when I saw the second headline update on my phone, more detailed, more direct, confirming what the town had already decided to believe hours earlier. Melissa Carter's name was now fully attached to the story, no longer separate from it, no longer protected by ambiguity. I stood there for a moment, not reacting outwardly, but internally recognizing something irreversible had taken shape. The life I thought I was observing from the inside was no longer something I could stand outside of. I was already inside the consequences, even if I had not chosen the direction they were moving in. I thought the hardest part would be the moment everything became public, but I was wrong. The hardest part was what came after, when the story stopped feeling like a sudden event and started feeling like a system that kept reproducing itself without pause. By the time I returned to Ashtonville that evening, the town no longer looked like a place reacting to news, but like a place adapting to it. People were no longer whispering in isolation. They were exchanging fragments openly, carefully, as if testing how much of the situation could be safely acknowledged. I stopped at a traffic light near Elm Street and noticed a small group gathered outside a coffee shop, their phones held low but active, each screen showing variations of the same headline, the same image, the same unfolding narrative. No one looked surprised anymore. It was as if surprise had already been spent and replaced by interpretation. When I finally arrived home, the house felt different again, not physically changed but emotionally. Reclassified, like it no longer belonged solely to me. There were two additional vehicles parked further down the street, both unmarked, both positioned in a way that suggested observation rather than coincidence. I did not immediately go inside. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the front door as if it had become a threshold to something I had not fully agreed to enter. Inside, the air was still, but it carried a different weight, the kind that forms when conversations have happened without you present. My phone had been quiet for nearly 20 minutes, which felt more unsettling than when it was constantly vibrating. Silence, I realized, was no longer absence. It was coordination. I received another call from Detective Ryan Holt just before I stepped through the door. His tone was steady, but there was a noticeable shift in how he framed information, less explanation, more confirmation. He told me that Melissa had been formally processed through initial questioning and that additional entities connected to the financial flow were now under review. He did not elaborate on specifics, but the implication was clear that this was no longer a contained situation. After the call, I finally entered the house. The living room looked exactly as I had left it earlier that day, yet it felt like a version of the space that had already been discussed by others. I noticed small details I had previously ignored: the alignment of objects, the absence of movement, the way light settled differently depending on where I stood. I sat down for a while without turning on the television or opening my laptop. I did not want more information. I wanted continuity, something that still behaved according to predictable rules. But nothing did. Around early evening, a neighbor I had spoken to only in passing knocked once and left a folded note at the door. It contained no message, only a printed copy of the same public article I had already seen, as if repetition itself had become a form of communication. I placed it on the table without reading it again. Later, I stepped outside briefly and noticed that the news vans were no longer just parked at a distance. One had moved closer, positioned near the corner of my street, its camera angled not directly at my house, but at the general direction of it, as if capturing context rather than focus. I did not approach it. I did not need to. The presence alone was enough to confirm that the narrative had fully detached from my control. That night, I sat by the window and watched the town continue its quiet transformation. Lights turned on and off in nearby homes. Cars passed with slower timing than usual, and every movement seemed slightly intentional, as if people were aware they were part of something larger than themselves. And in that extended stillness, I understood something that had been forming since the first headline appeared. This was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would continue happening long after anyone involved believed it was over. I stopped counting the hours after midnight, not because time disappeared, but because it stopped behaving like something I could measure in a meaningful way. Ashtonville had entered a different phase by then, one where everything felt slightly delayed, as if events were being processed somewhere else before reaching me. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone lit up again with a message from Detective Ryan Holt asking me to meet him early the next day at a small municipal office near Court Street. There was no urgency in the wording, just necessity, and somehow that made it heavier. I did not sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water I never finished, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off, thinking about how quickly my life had been reclassified from ordinary to referenced. Morning arrived without transition. The sky over Ashtonville was pale and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary instead of permanent. I drove to the municipal office just after 7:30 a.m. and parked 2 spaces away from a white sedan that I assumed belonged to Holt. He was already inside when I entered, sitting at a small table with a thin folder in front of him. He did not stand immediately, just acknowledged me with a nod that felt procedural rather than personal. The room was simple, almost intentionally so, with beige walls and a faint smell of old paper and cleaning solution. Holt began by explaining that the investigation had moved into a verification phase, which meant less speculation and more confirmation of documented activity. He spoke about account tracing, authorization trails, and discrepancies in reporting cycles tied to entities connected through Melissa's consulting work. He never raised his voice, never added emotional weight, but every sentence felt like it added structure to something I had only experienced as chaos. At one point, he slid a printed document across the table. It showed transaction summaries, dates, and coded references that linked multiple accounts across different institutions. I studied it carefully, not because I expected to find something new, but because I needed to understand how far removed my perception had been from the underlying structure of events. Holt asked me again if I had ever directly participated in any of these financial decisions. I told him the truth, that I had not. My involvement, as far as I understood it, had always been indirect at best, peripheral in ways I never questioned until now. He made a note, but did not react. That lack of reaction was its own kind of confirmation. After about 40 minutes, the conversation shifted. He told me that Melissa had requested legal representation and that any further communication would go through formal channels. He did not elaborate on her condition or her statements, only that the process was now moving forward independently of individual perspectives. When I left the office, the sunlight felt sharper than before, as if the world had adjusted contrast while I was inside. I drove aimlessly for a while, not because I was lost, but because I was trying to find a version of movement that did not feel like consequence. Eventually, I ended up near the edge of town, where the roads widened and the buildings became sparse. There, I saw something that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. A small group of people had gathered near a local news truck, not speaking loudly, not reacting dramatically, just observing. They were not waiting for new information anymore. They were waiting for resolution. I realized then that the town had fully transitioned from curiosity to expectation. Later that afternoon, I returned home to find another envelope at the door. This one was different, thicker, official in a way that required no explanation. I did not open it immediately. I set it on the table and sat across from it for a long time, understanding that some information does not change reality when read. It only confirms what reality has already decided. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding since the beginning. Whatever came next was no longer about discovery. It was about closure, whether I was ready for it or not. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt less like peace and more like anticipation, as if Ashtonville itself was holding its breath for something already scheduled to happen. I woke before my alarm, not because I was rested, but because sleep had become irrelevant to the rhythm of what was unfolding. The envelope I had placed on the table the night before remained exactly where I left it, untouched, like a boundary I had not yet decided to cross. I made coffee without thinking about it, stood by the kitchen window, and watched a light frost dissolve slowly on the edge of the driveway as the sun rose over the rooftops. Everything looked normal in the way things sometimes do right before they stop being normal permanently. At 8:10 a.m., Detective Ryan Holt called again and told me I needed to be present at a formal statement review scheduled for later that morning at the county administrative building. His tone carried the same controlled neutrality I had come to recognize, but there was something final in the way he confirmed the time, like all remaining uncertainty had already been filtered out of the process. When I arrived at the building, the parking lot was more crowded than before. Not chaotic, just populated with intention. There were official vehicles, media vans positioned farther back than the entrance, and small clusters of people who looked like they were waiting for permission to understand what they were witnessing. Inside, the air was colder than I expected, the kind of temperature that keeps a room emotionally distant no matter what is said within it. Holt met me in the hallway and led me to a larger conference room than the one we had used before. This time, there were more people present, including a county representative and a legal advisor I did not recognize. No one greeted me beyond brief acknowledgments. The atmosphere was procedural, structured, and deliberately restrained. They did not begin with explanation. They began with confirmation. Documents were placed on the table in a sequence that suggested preparation rather than discovery. I listened as they outlined the formal charges being reviewed, the scope of the financial investigation, and the administrative steps already taken regarding asset freezes and account audits. The language was careful, avoiding emotion entirely, but the weight of it filled the room anyway. At one point, Holt mentioned that Melissa Carter had been officially transferred to county custody, pending further legal processing. He did not describe the details of her condition or behavior, only the status. Status was the word that kept repeating itself in different forms, as if reducing a person to procedural classification made the situation easier to contain. I asked one question during the entire meeting, not about guilt or outcome, but about timeline. How long this phase would continue before resolution. The answer was uncertain, framed around legal process rather than prediction. When I left the building afterward, the air outside felt warmer, but not in a comforting way. It felt exposed. There were more reporters now, positioned at a distance that allowed observation without intrusion, their presence steady but restrained. No one approached me directly, but I could feel the attention shifting as I walked across the parking lot. I did not stop to speak. I drove instead, not toward home immediately, but along roads that circled the edge of town, as if movement itself could create perspective. At one point, I passed the courthouse again and saw a small group gathered near the steps, not loud, not chaotic, just waiting. That waiting felt more significant than anything else. It suggested that the story had already reached its final shape in the public mind, even if the legal system was still catching up to it. When I eventually returned home, the envelope was still on the table. This time, I opened it. Inside were formal documents confirming what had already been implied for days: notices, legal summaries, and procedural statements that reduced everything into structured language. I read all of it slowly, not because I needed clarification, but because I needed acknowledgement that the version of reality I had been living in was no longer active. When I finished, I set the papers down and looked around the house again. It felt unchanged, but no longer unaware. And in that quiet realization, I understood that closure was not something that arrives suddenly. It is something that assembles itself gradually, until one day you notice it has already taken the place of everything else. I did not sleep that night, not because I could not, but because sleep had become irrelevant to the rhythm of what was unfolding. Ashtonville had entered a different phase by then, one where everything felt slightly delayed, as if events were being processed somewhere else before reaching me. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone lit up again with a message from Detective Ryan Holt asking me to meet him early the next day at a small municipal office near Court Street. There was no urgency in the wording, just necessity, and somehow that made it heavier. I did not sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water I never finished, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off, thinking about how quickly my life had been reclassified from ordinary to referenced. Morning arrived without transition. The sky over Ashtonville was pale and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary instead of permanent. I drove to the municipal office just after 7:30 a.m. and parked 2 spaces away from a white sedan that I assumed belonged to Holt. He was already inside when I entered, sitting at a small table with a thin folder in front of him. He did not stand immediately, just acknowledged me with a nod that felt procedural rather than personal. The room was simple, almost intentionally so, with beige walls and a faint smell of old paper and cleaning solution. Holt began by explaining that the investigation had moved into a verification phase, which meant less speculation and more confirmation of documented activity. He spoke about account tracing, authorization trails, and discrepancies in reporting cycles tied to entities connected through Melissa's consulting work. He never raised his voice, never added emotional weight, but every sentence felt like it added structure to something I had only experienced as chaos. At one point, he slid a printed document across the table. It showed transaction summaries, dates, and coded references that linked multiple accounts across different institutions. I studied it carefully, not because I expected to find something new, but because I needed to understand how far removed my perception had been from the underlying structure of events. Holt asked me again if I had ever directly participated in any of these financial decisions. I told him the truth, that I had not. My involvement had always been indirect at best, peripheral in ways I never questioned until now. He made a note, but did not react. That lack of reaction was its own kind of confirmation. The final meeting took place in the same administrative building, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that was no longer subtle. There were fewer people in the room, but more certainty in every document placed on the table in front of me. Detective Ryan Holt did not begin with explanation this time, only with confirmation of outcomes that had already been decided through process. They stated that the financial investigation had reached its conclusion phase and that all remaining actions were procedural rather than investigative. I listened without interrupting, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nothing that required saying anymore. For the first time, I understood that silence was no longer observation, it was conclusion. Outside the building, reporters had increased in number, but decreased in approach, as if distance itself had become a form of respect. I walked past them without stopping. hearing only fragments of conversation that no longer felt connected to my life. When I returned home, the street felt quieter, not because it was empty, but because attention had already moved elsewhere. The envelope from earlier was still on the table, now opened, its contents no longer representing uncertainty, but confirmation. I reviewed the documents again, not searching for new information, but searching for alignment between what I knew and what was officially stated. There was none, and in that absence, I realized the case was no longer about discovery, but about finality. Later that evening, the town's news cycle shifted again, this time presenting the outcome in fully structured language. Melissa Carter's name appeared in official reporting, no longer attached to speculation, but to procedural resolution. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt completion, which is not the same thing. That distinction stayed with me longer than any headline or document. Because headlines fade, but structure remains. In the days that followed, Ashtonville began to return to its normal rhythm, but it was a version of normal that had been permanently adjusted. People no longer spoke about the situation openly, but they no longer needed to. The understanding was already distributed. I found myself returning to routine tasks at work, but each task felt slightly disconnected from its original importance. It was as if meaning had shifted location, not disappeared. One afternoon, I received a final call from Detective Ryan Holt. He informed me that the case had moved into final administrative closure. There would be no further requests for statements. Everything had been accounted for within the legal framework. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time, not processing new information, but processing the absence of uncertainty. The house around me felt less like a place of residence and more like a record of what had already been resolved. I realized then that closure does not arrive as an event. It arrives as a gradual reduction of questions until none remain relevant. And when that happens, a person is left not with answers, but with structure that no longer changes. That was the state I found myself in, standing in a town that no longer reacted, only remembered. And in that memory, everything that had once felt uncertain finally settled into something I could no longer misinterpret. I did not call it peace, and I did not call it resolution. I simply recognized it as the end of motion. I did not expect the final morning in Ashtonville to feel so ordinary, but that was exactly what made it unsettling. The sun rose over the town with the same soft light it always had, casting long shadows across empty sidewalks and quiet intersections, as if nothing inside the last several days had altered the physical world at all. I stood in my kitchen for a long time without moving, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock, realizing it was the first time in days I had not checked my phone immediately after waking up. There were no new alerts, no new calls, no new updates waiting to reshape the situation. For the first time, absence itself felt like confirmation. I drove through town later that morning without any destination. The streets looked familiar in a way that no longer carried the same emotional weight. Places that had once felt connected to daily life now felt like markers on a map of something that had already concluded. The coffee shop on Maple Avenue was open as usual, and a few people sat inside near the window, talking quietly, their conversations no longer shaped by urgency. Even the news van that had been parked near Court Street was gone. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided to move its attention forward without announcing the transition. I stopped briefly near City Hall, not because I needed to go inside, but because I remembered standing there days earlier when everything felt unresolved. Now the steps were empty, and the space that had once held clusters of observers was clear. There was no sense of spectacle anymore, only routine. By midday, I returned to the municipal building where everything had formally converged. Detective Ryan Holt was no longer waiting for me, and there were no further meetings scheduled. Instead, I was directed to a final administrative desk where a clerk handed me a short confirmation document stating that all investigative procedures connected to the case had reached closure. The language was precise, neutral, and deliberately detached. I signed where I was instructed, not because I fully processed what it meant, but because there was nothing left to question within the system itself. When I left the building, I paused for a moment on the steps. The air felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. The weight that had been attached to every movement, every conversation, every silence over the past days was no longer present. It had been replaced by something harder to define, something closer to structure than emotion. I did not feel relief. I did not feel loss in the way I expected either. What I felt was distance from a version of events that no longer required my participation. In the days that followed, Ashtonville returned fully to its normal rhythm. People resumed their routines. Conversations shifted back to ordinary subjects, and the presence of the situation faded into background memory rather than active discussion. I went back to work, resumed meetings, reviewed reports, and responded to emails that had been waiting. Each task felt intact but slightly removed, as if I was operating inside a system that had continued functioning while I had been temporarily redirected elsewhere. There was no dramatic conclusion, no final conversation that tied everything together. Instead, there was only the gradual recognition that the system had already closed the chapter without needing my interpretation of it. One evening, I found myself sitting by the window again, watching the town settle into its usual nighttime pattern. Lights turned on in familiar houses, cars passed at steady intervals, and the quiet returned in a way that no longer felt uncertain. I realized then that what I had been waiting for was not resolution itself, but acknowledgement of resolution. And once that acknowledgement arrived, there was nothing left to pursue. No unanswered questions remained in a practical sense. No unresolved threads required attention. The story had already completed its own transition from event to record. And in that final recognition, I understood something simple but permanent. Some moments do not end with clarity or explanation. They end with the world continuing forward without them, leaving only the structure of what happened behind.